morning, everybody, and welcome to this week's edition of Keeping an Eye on the Geopolitical Ball with me, Jamie Shea, Senior Fellow at Friends of Europe. Those of you who follow the Eye on a regular basis, and of course I hope that's all of you, know that I try to cover issues which are not necessarily on the front pages of the newspapers or part of the daily crisis, but which nonetheless are important in determining geopolitics in the 21st century. And my topic this week fits into that category. It's the reform of the World Trade Organization. Now, many of you will know that this body was established in 1994 to succeed the old General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. And it reflected the fact that in 1994, the Berlin Wall had come down, the Cold War was at an end, China was emerging, as were Brazil and India and other countries, into the international economic system. And there was a sense that we needed one universal system of rules that everybody would play by, because the belief was then, as now, that trade was one of the best things that we can do to raise prosperity levels, lift people out of poverty, and gradually sort of knit the world together in a way that would avoid a return to the Great Depression and the beggar thy neighbor economic policies of the 1930s. Today, the WTO has 164 members, which is double what the old GATT used to have, and 23 countries are waiting to join. So this is success after a fashion. But we also have to look at what has gone wrong. The WTO has not agreed a substantial new trade round for the last 25 years. We're still largely living with the so-called Uruguay round results of the 1970s when it comes to goods and services. Also, there is a perception that the WTO is having a midlife crisis. For example, as I've said, no new agreements. Secondly, Trump, when he was president of the United States, largely paralyzed the WTO by refusing the appointment of new judges to the so-called appellate panels of the dispute resolution mechanism. And that's one of the key functions of the WTO, of course, to adjudicate disputes on a fair basis in a way that both sides will accept. Also, COVID-19 has seen a sort of secret return to protectionism as governments have not allowed vaccines to cross borders, have given illegal subsidies to their industries, and so on. The WTO's record in monitoring compliance with its provisions has also been somewhat uneven. And when you have failures in the three core tasks, which are negotiating new agreements, monitoring existing agreements, and resolving disputes, then Houston, we have a problem, as we would say. But the WTO is still worth saving, because even if you take an organization like the European Union, which has signed 43 agreements with 78 states around the world, even the EU today still conducts 2/3 of its international trade on so-called WTO terms, particularly with big players like the United States, China, Russia, India, Brazil, with which it does not have individual agreements. For example, the latest agreement, Mercosur, between the EU and Latin America, has not yet been ratified. So there is still an interest in a global system. But we have to address the problems. One is the declining leadership of the United States. The US speaks now of a worker-centric trade policy, which is a byword for protectionism. There's also the fact that many states in the WTO are asking for what they call policy space, which is a WTO euphemism for bending the rules or asking for opt-outs. China likes the status quo. India isn't really interested because it wants to protect its farmers and its industries, and so on. Sometimes the feeling is it's only the original WTO members, particularly from the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, that are still interested. There's also the consensus rule in the WTO, like in many international organizations, which means that everybody has to say yes before any reform can take place, and therefore no reform ever does. But still, as the WTO looks towards its next ministerial meeting next June, reform is in the air, and there is hope that maybe things now could move. For example, the US and the Europeans are working much much better together in the Biden administration, and they have done trade deals in terms of resolving disputes over Boeing and Airbus subsidies or steel and aluminium. Secondly, as China has started bullying certain countries using trade as a form of political coercion, as we saw recently in the case of Lithuania, there is a renewed interest in pushing back against China legally by taking disputes to the WTO, as the EU is now doing over the case of Lithuania. Thirdly, there's a new Director General, the first woman leader, the first African leader, Dr. Nkosi, who is putting the issue of trade fairness for the developing countries, Africa and elsewhere, on the agenda. So if there is hope, what could a reform policy look like? Well, first of all, unblock these dispute resolution mechanisms. There is a temporary ad hoc one at the moment, which the EU has set up with 24 other countries, and that is looking at the Lithuanian dispute vis-a-vis China. But clearly we need the proper WTO dispute resolution to function again. Secondly, broaden the agenda so that issues which are now key to world trade, but which were not there at the beginning of the WTO, are given much more prominence. Issues like climate change, of course, where the Saudis have been blocking progress, that cannot be allowed to stand. Issues of data and privacy and data protection and data flows as well. Issues of e-commerce, electronic commerce, fishing rights, with the problem of overfishing of the seas, and forced labor. For example, the way in which the Uyghurs have been used in China to produce goods for export and so on. The third issue is investment protection, and particularly this contentious issue of intellectual property and waivers that have come up during the COVID-19 issue with vaccines, and the extent to which, when you have a big emergency like COVID, the companies like Pfizer or AstraZeneca or Johnson & Johnson should waive their intellectual property. Fourth issue is flexibility. Can we break this consensus rule in the WTO in a way which would allow small groups to make progress in certain areas, to set new standards, provided that these groups are transparent and open for others to join at a later stage? And finally, getting civil society involved, as well as the private sector and business, because we've seen, for example, with climate change in the COP26 in Glasgow, that when you get civil society and the private sector involved, you get more pressure on governments to act, and the final result has greater legitimacy in terms of engaging our public opinion. An EU official on a call that I recently participated in said with frustration that the only place where WTO reform is not being discussed is in the WTO itself. Let's hope that the meeting of the ministers in Geneva next June can rectify this situation. As Adam Smith with The Wealth of Nations told us already in the 18th century, trade is our best peace policy, and the WTO may be the last best hope for mankind and womankind in that connection. Thank you for watching and listening today. Look forward to engaging with you next week.